One way of kicking this off would be to ask Peter about the title of his best-selling book. I must admit, when you handed me The Bound Galleys in San Francisco, I took a kind of step back, because 0 to 1, where I come from, is a football score. Did it occur to you that you've given your book the title that, you know, most Londoners would associate with Arsenal Football Club?
Yeah, I became aware of that somewhat after the fact, and it's, I gather, not the football score you generally want to have either. It basically it comes from this question of how does one start new things? How does one create new things? And it comes out of a contrast that I develop in the book between two different modalities of progress that I think are very important in the 21st century. One of them is globalization, which I always draw on the x-axis, involves copying things that work, going from 1 to n, doing more of things that already work. And then the other modality I describe as technology, broadly understood, doing new things, drawn on the y-axis. It's vertical, intensive progress, going from 0 to 1. So globalization is going from 1 to 100 typewriters. Technology would be going from a typewriter to a word processor. And I believe we live in a world that for many decades has been more dominated by globalization than by technology. A lot of what's worked best in the last 40, 50 years has been more on the globalization side. For a number of reasons, I think that this has been somewhat unbalanced, that if we're going to have a successful 21st century, it will require a somewhat higher ratio of technological progress than we've had in recent decades. But at the same time, it's a very strange kind of a thing, because doing new things has a very different character from copying things that work. You know, copying things that work is sort of mechanistic, formulaic. There's a sense in which sort of conventional science always starts with a number 2. It starts with experiments you can repeat and do over again, whereas inventing new things is not quite scientific. You know, the next Bill Gates will not start an operating system company. The next Larry Page will not start a search engine. The next Mark Zuckerberg won't start a social network. And if you try to copy these people, there's some sense in which you're not learning from them. So this is sort of a deep paradox in teaching about entrepreneurship, because, you know, the core advice is you have to do something new. And if I try to reduce that to a formula, you have lost the essence of everything.
I want to ask you briefly about Facebook, because that's one of your most famous and successful investments. I just want to make everybody, including myself, squirm a bit. In August 2004, you put $500,000 into a company called Facebook, and that bought you just over 10% of the equity. When you sold that investment, you haven't sold it all, I think you still have 5 million shares? The sales in 2 tranches yielded more than $1 billion. If that doesn't make you feel terrible, I think the only person it doesn't make feel terrible is probably Alan, but everybody else is going.
Neil, this is not like a zero-sum world. Hopefully, as long as we have progress in our world, it shouldn't be quite that zero-sum.
But let me ask you about how you saw the potential in that company. Tell us a bit about how you can tell a winner from a loser, because you see a whole ton of tech companies that come and pitch to you in your venture capital mode. How can you spot a winner as big as Zuckerberg?
Well, it's it probably would be somewhat misleading to say that all of this could be seen from the very beginning. I had looked at it already, a number of these different social networking sites, and there were definitely a lot of the early attributes were quite good. They seemed very competent technically, which was actually strangely not true of many of the other companies. But I think one of the other things to always I'm always very focused on at this point is not just the product or the abilities of the people, but sort of the third part is what I would describe as the business model, the business strategy. And I think that's often not given enough weight, because inventing something new is generally good for the world. It doesn't mean that you automatically will do well as an inventor. In fact, most scientists and inventors end up capturing disturbingly little of the value you create. To succeed as an inventor or scientist or entrepreneur, you have to create X dollars of value for the world, and you have to capture Y% of X. And the one important detail people forget is that X and Y are completely independent variables, and that in most cases, Y equals 0%. And this is sort of I think
That's certainly been my own experience.
Well, we're not commenting on the magnitude of X either here, but we'll leave that unanswered. Even if you had generated vast amounts of value for the world, how much of that you capture is quite open-ended. And I think there is sort of a history of innovation that one could tell, where most of the time the business models have been far too competitive. It's been far too difficult to capture anything of great value. The business model that I'm very fixated on, which I think anyone who starts a company, invests in one, joins one early on, you should always aim for monopoly. This is sort of my one big transgressive idea. You're not allowed to talk about it.
They shuddered when you said that.
The fact that you're not allowed to talk about it is, I think, always a bit of a clue that it's perhaps an underexplored idea. And there are certainly questions: at what point is this good for society? At what point is it bad for society? We have antitrust laws to protect us from bad monopolies. On the other hand, we have copyright, patent, trademark laws to encourage the creation of new things. So from a society perspective, it's very complicated. But from the inside, you always want to have a monopoly. And I think one of the sort of key early indications for a monopoly is not, do you have a vast market, which is sort of the standard business school model. You want to go after big markets. Big markets, I think, are often quite bad because they mean there are lots of people in them. You could open a restaurant in London. The food service market industry is an enormous industry, and it's ferociously competitive. You will never make any money. So if you want to compete like crazy and not make money, you should open a restaurant. And then I
hope there are no restaurateurs here sobbing as you speak.
And I think sort of I think in some ways, one of the things that's been very powerfully successful is where you've captured small markets and then sort of grown the market over time. PayPal started with the power sellers on eBay, which was a subset of e-commerce. There was a really tricky payments problem. There were maybe 20 or 30,000 of these people in late '99 when we launched. And we captured maybe 25, 30% market share over 4 to 5 months, which was sort of a very auspicious start. And then you gradually build it out in concentric circles from there. Facebook started with 10,000 students at Harvard University, a market so small that if you had written it up as a business plan, it would have never gotten funded. People would say that's way too small a market to be interesting. And you went from 0 to 60% market share in 10 days, which was an extremely auspicious start. And then it turned out that could be replicated at other colleges and beyond.
Is it true that your advice to Zuckerberg at one point was simply don't F it up?
I'm not sure. Maybe don't mess it up, something like that.
Did you ask him your killer question, which you cite in the book as the question you always ask people you're interviewing as potential employees? Quote, what important truth do very few people agree with you on? Did you ask him that question?
I think I sort of focused on that question in years later. I don't always ask it because it turns out to be, it's one of these interview questions.
You can't ask it anymore because you've put it in a book.
It's actually,
they're all prepped for it.
There's a subset of interview questions. Most interview questions, once you know they exist, lose their value. So if you have some sort of strange math puzzle and you can memorize the answer, then it doesn't work quite as well anymore. So these are like most of the Google interview questions are these math puzzles, and people just eventually memorize how to do them all. But I think this is actually one of those unusual questions where even if you read on the internet that I ask it of everybody, it doesn't make it much easier to answer, because the answer to this question, it's not a hard question because you have to be super brilliant to have some idea of a truth that other people don't agree with you on. I think most of us actually have answers to this question. The real problem is a psychosocial one. It's very uncomfortable because the correct answer isn't something lame like the education system doesn't work or our politicians are a bunch of clowns or things like that everybody already agrees on. The answers have to be things that the interviewer or the person you're talking to will be deeply uncomfortable about, and therefore, I think we live in a world in which courage is in far shorter supply than genius.
I certainly agree with that. Is your version, is your answer to the question, monopoly is okay? I mean,
Well,
is that your shocking view that
well,
most people don't hold?
You know, I mean, certainly my most shocking answers I would refuse to give in any context. It's just out of self-preservation. So
Darn, I was hoping to draw you
but
into
the
it.
monopoly is roughly at the limit of what I'd be willing to say. You know, the somewhat flip answer that I always give is that that people think this is an easy question to answer, but it is a hard question because there's something about originality that's always much harder than people think. You know, already in the time of Shakespeare, the word ape meant both primate and to imitate. And there's something, it's sort of how human beings learn. It's how we learn language from our parents. It's how, culture gets transmitted in our society. We are these incredibly powerful imitating machines. But then there also are places where this goes very wrong. It goes wrong in sort of the madness of crowds and financial market bubbles, in sort of runaway crazy fashions of one sort or another. And so somehow being able to think for oneself is always easy to say, very hard to do. There's a somewhat strange phenomenon in Silicon Valley where a surprisingly large number of the successful founders and entrepreneurs seem to be suffering from a mild form of Asperger's or something like this.
Mentioning no names.
Mentioning no names. But I think we need to always turn this around as an indictment of our society and say, what is it about our society where if you are not suffering from Asperger's, you will sort of be subtly talked out of all of your interesting original ideas before they're even fully formed. You will sort of pick up on subtle cues from the people around you. Oh, that's a little bit too strange. People are looking at me funny. I better not say that. I better not do that. You know, I should just go open that restaurant after all. They've done these studies at Harvard Business School, which you can sort of, I often think of the business school contingent, with apologies to people in the audience here, but I think of the business school contingent as sort of the anti-Asperger's contingent. It's sort of people who are extremely socially adapted. They're very well socialized. They may be somewhat low on the conviction level, and when you put all these people in a hothouse environment for 2 years, where they're supposed to figure out what they're going to do with the rest of their lives, and they talk to one another, and of course nobody has a clue what to do. This is sort of a formula for some rather bad decisions getting made. And they've done these studies at Harvard Business School where they found that the largest cohort of people systematically end up going into the wrong thing. They all sort of after 2 years conclude they should all try to catch the last wave by when it's generally too late. So, in 1989, they all wanted to work for Michael Milken, 1 or 2 years before he really got in trouble with the junk bonds. They were never interested in tech except for 99, 2000, when they descended on Silicon Valley and timed the end of the dot-com bubble perfectly, and on and on.
Where are they now? I'd quite like to know. Are they back in Silicon Valley? Because there's a sense of, one can hear, I mean, I'm working at Harvard, I should perhaps defend the institution, but you
That's a very robust defense you're giving there.
It's a wonderful university. The business, it is a wonderful university. No, it really is. We'll come back to universities in a minute. I don't want to give the game away, because Peter has extremely interesting views on university. But he's a Stanford guy, so you should expect him to run Harvard down. But what is interesting at the moment is the subtle suspicion that maybe, and this is very much at the business school, maybe the action is in fact on the West Coast. Does that mean they're all coming back to Silicon Valley just in time for another dot-com crash?
It's. I think these things probably work best at the very extreme points. I'm not sure it's quite extreme enough to signal that, but yeah, there probably are a lot of people who end up trying to be somewhat fake entrepreneurs, where the goal is to be an entrepreneur. If you ask people, what do you want to do with your life? What do you want to do when you grow up? I want to be an entrepreneur, which I always think is a somewhat too common, disturbingly somewhat too common. And I think it's saying that you want to be an entrepreneur is sort of like saying I want to be rich or I want to be famous. Nobody in their right mind starts a company for the sake of starting a company. You start a company because there's a very important problem to solve that's not getting solved in large, governmental or nonprofit or for-profit institutions. And that's why you actually need to start a new company. Just starting a company for the sake of doing so is a really odd thing to do.